CBC Television, Canada's own.
Tonight, let the games begin. Pageantry, patriotism, and pride at the opening ceremony for the Salt Lake City Olympics. Digging deeper. Police keep searching this BC pig farm looking for a link to 50 missing Vancouver women. Camouflage flap. How far will some Canadians go to blend into the Afghan landscape? Pretty far. They're painting those forest green uniforms. And skating for gold. Canada's world champion pair skaters, Jamie Salé and David Pelletier.
When you actually get that chance to be there, nothing's going to stop you.
The National. From Salt Lake City, here is Peter Mansbridge.
And good evening from the Rice-Eccles Stadium here in Salt Lake City. The 19th Winter Olympic Games are now officially underway. They were opened by President George W. Bush just a little while ago here in Salt Lake. Now, these ceremonies, the opening ceremonies, are always spectacular. This one was no exception. But it was also a ceremony that didn't ignore the fact that the host nation is a nation still in mourning. We begin our coverage tonight with the CBC's Adrian Arsenault.
Under the tightest of security blankets, in front of 52,000 people in Rice-Eccles Stadium, and beamed to 3 billion others worldwide,
Salt Lake City.
The Olympics begin.
The President of the United States of America, George W. Bush.
Taking no time at all to make the point that these are the Patriot Games.
Ladies and gentlemen, the American flag that flew at the World Trade Center on September 11th is being carried into the stadium.
Silence in the stadium as that flag is carried in by athletes, police officers, and firefighters. And that is the Mormon Tabernacle Choir singing the American National Anthem. The Olympics, though, are a global celebration, and in that spirit, a young boy skates through the stadium. He is called the Child of Light, representing all humanity. He faces a storm, considered life's adversities, but comes through it, igniting his human spirit. Lighting the fire within. That is the theme Salt Lake has adopted for these games, which ultimately are all about the athletes.
Ladies and gentlemen, the athletes of the 19th Olympic Winter Games.
There are 2,500 of them here, making these the biggest Winter Games ever. Big applause for the unlikeliest of teams.
Les Bermudes.
And for old favorites.
Le Canada.
Canada.
156 athletes. Canada has never had a winter team this large or talented. The team's goal is to win enough medals to come third in the overall Olympic standings. That would be a Canadian first.
United States of America.
Coming in last, the team that so badly wants to do well to invigorate a wounded nation. After a blessing from 5 tribal chiefs, a native Canadian, Robbie Robertson, took the mic. And then a celebration of the pioneers of the American West.
Ladies and gentlemen.
For all of the celebration, an unprecedented acknowledgement from the IOC president, Jacques Roga, of the current climate in this host country.
Your nation is overcoming a horrific tragedy. a tragedy that has affected the whole world. We stand united with you in the promotion of our common ideals.
On behalf of a proud, determined, and grateful nation, I declare open the Games of Salt Lake City, celebrating the Olympic Winter Games.
Finally, the ceremony's most anticipated moment. The 1980 USA men's hockey team to light the cauldron. The Miracle on Ice team that lifted this country a generation ago. A hint the Americans hope of the possibilities ahead, and a reminder to the world of the exhilaration that sports can bring. These games have now begun. Adrian Arsenault, CBC News, Salt Lake City.
Well, as we've been reporting over these past few days, security has been a big part of the story here at these games, and it was again tonight. For a number of hours this evening, this was a no-fly zone in the skies above Salt Lake City, but NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, is reporting tonight that there were a couple of violations of the no-fly zone, private aircraft getting in the air and into the airspace over Salt Lake City. They were not serious violations, says NORAD, but there were violations nevertheless. Now, Ian Hannamansing has been watching the games as well from outside the stadium, both today and tonight. Here's his report.
Open all zippers on your bags to have them available for inspection.
Everyone knew security would be at its tightest at the opening ceremony. What many wondered was how the system would handle the tens of thousands of spectators streaming past the hundreds of police officers into Rice-Eccles Stadium. It appears everything worked. No long lineups, no long delays. That's not to say security has been smooth throughout this week. The multiple checks have slowed people down. And in the case of the coach for Canadian skater Elvis Stojko, it left her stuck outside a practice rink.
I was walking around and everything was closed off for security because they had already done their sweep. So it was extremely frustrating. I can imagine what you guys are going through.
But the main frustration of this day came not from security, but weather. Wind and snow caused some training and qualifying runs to be postponed. Not all the news today was bad, though. With the world's media watching closely, officials released the results of extensive pre-games drug tests. Despite the rumors that had been swirling around, no new expulsions were announced. The final tally, in 3,600 tests, only 27 positives.
That indicates that 99.5% of the athletes out there are playing fair. The downside is that there is a very small percentage, half of 1%, that are cheating.
So on the eve of the games, the focus was squarely on sport. And for many of the Canadian athletes, quiet confidence.
I'm not going to say, well, I want to do my best and whatever. I want to be on the podium on each distance. That's what I want to do.
High hopes as well from some of the spectators at the opening ceremony.
I'm really hoping that it will be a time for us to think about how much closer our world is and that we're not just Americans, we're part of a larger world.
Among the many visitors here from around the world, Ross Rebliati, apparently. The Canadian snowboarder who won gold in Nagano was originally denied access to the United States. But today, according to his lawyer, Rebliati went to the border, signed an agreement that he wouldn't smoke marijuana while in the United States, and was allowed into this country for up to 4 months. Ian Hannamansing, CBC News, Salt Lake City.
Well, joining me again, Brian Williams of CBC Sports. We call him Mr. Olympics. Brian, you and I have covered enough of these opening ceremonies back since 1988, but you've covered 10 Olympic Games in all. How do you rate this opening ceremony?
Well, this is right near the top. No one does a ceremony like Don Misher in the United States. It saluted the America West, but it saluted the Olympics. I said before the Games, this is a changed country. The American people are respectful of other nations. We saw that here tonight. And I was very happy to see Dr. Jacques Rogo, we had the interview earlier, mention September the 11th. And as you pointed out, there were victims not just from the United States, but from more than 80 countries on that horrific day.
And I think that's why the LAOC finally ignored the sort of controversy around the flag flag, the World Trade Center flag coming in, realizing that this was a truly international day. Now, look ahead for us for the next couple of weeks. There's a lot of talk about how well Canada could do, and a lot of predictions will do better than ever before. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're putting me on the spot. 15 medals in Nagano was Canada's best ever, 6 gold. That can be surpassed here, but everything has to fall into place. And by that I mean sports like skeleton, we heard from Michelle Kelly earlier, bobsleigh, some of the sports that are not the glamour sports, and of course hockey. The men's hockey team has to come through. I think curling is a given. There's a great pressure on Katrina LeMay-Doan. It is possible to surpass 15. I think it could happen. I'm not saying it's a definite, because when you come to the Olympics, you know, certain athletes perform on the Olympic stage when they don't perform elsewhere. We saw that with Karen Lee Gardner, who had never won a World Cup race before she won the downhill in 1992. But remember, the opposite is true too. Athletes that win on the World Cup don't necessarily perform well on the world stage. It's possible. I think it could happen, but everything has to fall in place.
Briefly on the hockey team, the men's hockey team, the women's here, obviously, many of the men playing the NHL, not here yet. Stephen Brunt mentioned to me last night the concern was that, you know, we could do extremely well as a country on a lot of sports, but the hockey team might not do well, and that would take the glow off all the other achievements.
Well, the hockey team's a big story, but if the hockey team doesn't do well and Katrina LeMay-Doan wins 2 gold medals, I don't think it takes any of the glitter off those medals.
Okay, Brian, listen, have a great couple of weeks. We know you will. You always do.
Thanks,
Brian Williams from CBC Sports. Well, that's completes the story from here in Salt Lake City for us for tonight. It's been quite an evening, but there's lots of other news on this day, and Alison Smith joins us now from Toronto. Alison.
Thanks very much, Peter. And later in the program, we will have more on some Canadian gold medal hopefuls. But first, we have a lot of other news to get to. Beginning tonight with a farm at the heart of a huge investigation near Vancouver. Police are digging around looking for clues in the case of 50 missing women. But as Daryl McIntyre reports, it's hard to tell if they're making any progress.
All day today, police combed through the mud and the bushes around this once quiet farm, searching for clues. And according to a report in this Vancouver newspaper, they have already found some, including the personal belongings and ID of 2 of the 50 women who've gone missing. It's a report police refuse to comment on.
There have been some reports in the media about certain specific items and articles that have been found at this site. We will not confirm at this point any of the accuracy of those things that have been reported thus far.
That paper also reported today that police were warned years ago this Port Coquitlam farm may have been involved in the women's disappearance. For some families of the missing women, those reports are frustrating but not surprising.
A little over a year ago, I was concerned that the Vancouver City Police had lost the will and the commitment to continue on with an investigation. It looked as though they had ratcheted down an investigation.
And on the streets of Vancouver's downtown east side, where almost all of the missing women worked, those who still work aren't surprised either.
I don't know, the police are just starting to do something now.
Nor were the workers at Vancouver's Rape Crisis Center.
Our Rape Crisis Center has spoken to people who have identified the farm and identified the farm to police.
But again, police had little to say about the allegations.
Information that was received by police, whether it be the Vancouver Police or whether it be another agency, that information was shared, and what information could be acted upon was.
Meanwhile, there's still no word from the man who owns this farm, and Robert William Picton still hasn't returned home. Police continue to say that although his property is now the subject of one of the largest police searches in BC history, Picton himself still isn't a suspect. Daryl McIntyre, CBC News, Port Coquitlam, British Columbia.
Still ahead tonight, Canadian cover-up. Soldiers in Kandahar and their do-it-yourself solution to the uniform problem. And Zacharias Canuck.
As an Aboriginal person, we don't speak the same language.
The creative force behind the most talked about Canadian film in years. The Canadian economy is surprising some of the experts tonight, a result of the latest unemployment figures released today. The jobless rate was 7.9% in January, down from 8% in December. Now, while the drop is not big, it is encouraging. But as Rick Boguski reports, some economists are still concerned.
It's a sign of the times, improving times if you're looking for work.
It's easy if you look. I don't know,
know, a few of my roommates don't have jobs right now, and they're having a hard time, but you just have to look. You have to get out there, and you have to apply, and you'll find a job.
That's what many Canadians did last month. In fact, nearly 76,000 found jobs, the biggest monthly increase in 7 years.
Well, I hope it keeps going, because, I mean, we all got to work, right?
It's baffling economists who were predicting the year would start with job losses.
That's a pace of job creation that is good, that is excellent during a period of strong economic growth. But during an economic downturn like we've been seeing, it's nothing short of stunning.
Employment was created in a variety of sectors, from restaurants to manufacturing. Both are hiring again after tanking in September. While the employment figures look good, some believe they're tarnished slightly by the type of jobs that have been created. More than half are part-time, mostly low-paying.
Right, when we're at full employment.
Still, some university students say that's okay.
Growth in part-time jobs helps out students because they can get a part-time job and still go to school.
But according to economics professor Frank Atkins,
there is the problem of whether this part-time work is choice or not choice.
In other words, there are people searching for full-time work that can only find a part-time job, although economists like Douglas Porter believe that will change.
I look at the employment numbers as being a little bit more of a look in the rearview mirror rather than telling us what's going to happen in the months ahead. So I think as the economy improves, you'll start to see the full-time employment do better and later on this year.
A year that economists now predict will continue to pick up steam. But then again, these are the same economists who predicted January would mark job losses. Rick Kopeski, CBC News, Calgary.
It was a gloomy week on the financial markets, but things were looking up today. Here's a look at the closing figures. Canada, Robert Milton, is defending the airline's expansion plans. Yesterday, Transport Minister David Collinette accused Air Canada of beating up on the competition by adding more routes to its low-cost carrier, Tango. Today, Milton said he has to do what's best for Air Canada and the people who fly it.
I'm trying to get our company to react to the changed realities and deal with what the consumer wants, and not to be a case study down the road that says, geez, how come they didn't recognize that the market was changing? That's what this is about. That's what we're trying to deal with.
Milton also said if Air Canada doesn't expand Tango, it risks being forced out of the skies altogether by competitors. British Columbia's forestry minister says the United States is showing disrespect for this country. Mike de Jong is upset over Washington's refusal to budge on the softwood lumber issue. And he says Ottawa is running out of time to do something about it. Next month, U.S. trade officials are expected to reimpose a hefty tax on Canadian softwood lumber exports. Today, de Jong met with Ottawa's international trade minister. Pierre Pettigrew is optimistic the dispute can eventually be resolved. De Jong disagrees and says it's high time to turn up the heat.
We are polite, you know, as Canadians, and maybe the Americans need to hear in more detail just how angry and frustrated we are.
De Jong says Washington has been taking Canada for granted lately and suggests Ottawa should reconsider its military support for the U.S. in Afghanistan. Planning is moving ahead on that new North American military command. The U.S. president should have some hard proposals on his desk in the next few weeks. But how is Canada involved in the process? Eric Sorensen has the latest.
Canadian ground troops, naval ships, and aircraft are working side by side with U.S. forces in Afghanistan. It hasn't gone unnoticed in Washington.
I also want to join in welcoming our friends from Canada.
Before a congressional committee this week, the U.S. Defense Secretary thanked Canada for its military contribution.
For the very healthy and close working relationship that our two militaries have had now for any number of years.
But Canadian senators in attendance were more interested in what's happening on the home front. The Pentagon is about to propose a new military command structure to President Bush, a direct result of the attacks on September 11th. It would oversee the protection of an area from the North Pole to southern Mexico and extend 800 kilometers off the east and west coasts. It would bring air, sea, and land forces under one central U.S. command for North America. Canada already shares joint command for North American air defense under NORAD. The head of the Canadian Senate Committee was briefed by U.S. national security officials on how the new command might eventually include Canada.
They'd start with the air first because that's already in place and both countries seem to feel it's working well. And then they would ask us, how do we feel about a naval model? And is that in the Canadian interest? And we'd have an opportunity to say yes or no, and then the same would apply to ground forces.
The Minister of National Defense says it's worth exploring.
We will continue to command our own troops. We'll continue to do what is best for Canada. But cooperating with the United States on defense of our continent is something that is in our best interests.
Critics worry that Canada is rapidly spiraling into the U.S. orbit on military policy.
Now it seems to be ready, and whatever it is that the Americans want.
The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives says overhauling the North American military command structure would be an overreaction.
We need to be sure that the massive response that's being proposed is appropriate to these almost impossible problems.
Canada's Deputy Prime Minister brushes off criticism that Canada is becoming excessively pro-American. In fact, John Manley identified a point of difference today with Washington, saying he wouldn't label countries like Iran, Iraq, and North Korea the axis of evil, as President Bush did.
I don't disagree with them being criticized, but I don't think that we would have used quite the bellicose language that they did.
Officials in Washington say a new military command would be designed and established by the United States. Only then would Canada be invited to consider how this country might be a part of a joint command structure for North America. Eric Sorensen, CBC News, Ottawa.
The Canadians who've been setting up base in Afghanistan could begin their first patrols this weekend, and many have been getting ready by modifying their uniforms. They don't want to be easy targets, and as Paul Workman reports, they're doing whatever they can to blend in.
It's easy to pick out the Canadians on this sprawling desert army base. In a landscape that's entirely dusty brown, they're the ones wearing forest green and stand out, well, like trees in a desert, especially next to their American comrades.
If you're on the desert, you shouldn't have, you should be in desert camouflage. If you're on the forest, you should have forest camouflage.
New uniforms have been promised. Until then, some of the soldiers are painting on their own camouflage with their commander's approval. Flak jackets, helmets, even weapons have been sprayed or brushed desert brown. But nobody's complaining, at least not in public.
The Marines were in here and they were wearing greens themselves, so they didn't have any problems wearing it, and we shouldn't either.
Off the record, some of the Canadians will tell you the green uniform is useless in the desert. In the words of one member of an infantry unit here, we stand out like a big black blob. It's not clear if the soldiers got fed up and took matters into their own hands, or were simply following orders. Their commander says the camouflage paint is just a trial.
We're just trialing a couple of things, using some paint just to break up some of the outline of the uniform. They're trying different types of scrim in the helmet and those sorts of things. And that's normally an SOP when you deploy into an area, is to try and take on some of the local foliage. And here, the foliage is mainly sand.
For some of the Canadians here, the color of the uniform is not an issue. For others, it's an embarrassment and potentially dangerous to be sent into a desert war zone dressed for the deep woods. Paul Workman, CBC News, Kandahar.
The man who was foreign minister in Mullah Omar's Taliban government has turned himself in. He surrendered to U.S. forces in Kandahar and is being questioned tonight. There's still no word, however, on the whereabouts of Omar. Canada may be happy with it, but the International Red Cross says the new U.S. position on the treatment of prisoners from Afghanistan isn't good enough. Yesterday, the U.S. said Taliban fighters would be covered by the Geneva Conventions, but al-Qaeda fighters would not. The Red Cross says they must all be treated as prisoners of war unless a special tribunal decides otherwise. And a new system is being tested at London's Heathrow Airport to try to speed up security and immigration checks. It scans passengers' eyes, taking an image of the iris, and no two irises are alike. The system could replace passports one day. Today, the skipper of HMCS Vancouver said his crew saw some action in the Arabian Sea this week. They boarded and seized a tanker near the Iran-Pakistan border. The tanker is suspected of smuggling oil from Iraq. That would be a violation of UN sanctions. A speech Ralph Klein gave in Japan caused a stir back home today. The Alberta Premier said Canadian teachers only work 4 or 5 hours a day compared to 8 in Japan. And he said Japanese teachers don't go on strike. Half of Alberta's teachers walked off the job on Monday over a contract dispute. The head of their association called Klein's remarks insulting. A spokesperson for Klein later said the Premier was talking about how much time teachers spend in the classroom, not their entire workday. 1,500 Canadian women will die this year from ovarian cancer, mostly because the disease has spread by the time it's diagnosed. Well, today, researchers announced a new test that may detect this silent killer at a stage when it can be cured. Terry Reith explains.
Oh, it's just fabulous.
It's a big day for Gloria Shapiro. She's just heard about a new way of screening for ovarian cancer. When she went to her doctor 4 years ago, getting the right diagnosis wasn't easy.
My GP kept being told depression, sucking in air, bloating, nothing to be really concerned about. Never them telling me, well, maybe we should do some kind of test.
The problem with diagnosing ovarian cancer is symptoms look a lot like other things, and there's been no definitive test until now.
It is a far, far more accurate test than anything that exists today, and not by a small distance.
These are the 5 proteins.
The new test, developed by the U.S. National Institutes of Health, uses the new science of proteomics. A computer analyzes proteins in the body. Certain patterns and combinations reflect the presence of diseases, like ovarian cancer. For the patient, it's as easy as offering a blood sample. The test performed remarkably well on its first trial run. The test was performed on 116 samples. It correctly identified all 50 vials taken from women with ovarian cancer. It also correctly identified 63 samples from women who did not, and there were only 3 false positives. Most significant, the test detected every case of early-stage ovarian cancer. That's important because early detection dramatically improves the odds of survival, from a 35% survival rate over 5 years to 95%.
I think that this kind of technology means a lot for women across the board, not just women with ovarian cancer. This is a new paradigm in being able to detect the presence or absence of a disease.
Bigger studies are needed to see if the initial success can be reproduced. Any widespread use of the test is still 2 to 3 years away. Still, it's creating excitement among those treating ovarian cancer.
Although something of this magnitude hasn't been done directly in Canada, the potential to move forward fairly quickly exists.
And for Gloria Shapiro, some comfort, knowing that in the future, early detection will mean longer, better quality lives for women with ovarian cancer. Terry Reith, CBC News, Edmonton.
High Canadian hopes for medals at the Salt Lake City Games, especially in pairs figure skating, where Canadians Jamie Salé and David Pelletier are the reigning world champions. They're hoping to be the first Canadians since 1960 to win Olympic gold in pairs. The National's Joanna Rumley-Yotis has this profile.
Yes, they're ready to go.
It doesn't take much of a warm-up to get the picture. Meet Jamie Salé and David Pelletier, the hottest pair on ice and on the pre-Olympic circuit.
This morning on the road to Salt Lake City, we're honored to be on the Rockefeller Center rink with Jamie Salé and David Pelletier.
NBC has invited Salé and Pelletier to New York to feature them on its network morning show.
Jamie and David.
It's big league, and they know it.
David, that was great. Thank you so much. Good luck, both of you, all right? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
The most exciting thing would be getting to do all this kind of stuff. Today's show and
just the interviews that we get to do, and it's kind of neat not just to be in Canada and we get to be seen everywhere else.
The world is already